It was a bright and busy Saturday afternoon when Daniel Johnson pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store. The parking area was packed with cars, a bustling scene of families and individuals rushing to complete their weekend shopping. Daniel had been lucky enough to spot a space opening up near the front, and he carefully maneuvered his car into the spot. The air was thick with the typical noises of a crowded lot, distant horns honking, children laughing, and shopping carts rattling across the pavement. Just as Daniel turned off his engine, an aggressive honk pierced the air. A white SUV came speeding into the adjacent lane, nearly colliding with another vehicle in its haste. Behind the wheel was a middle-aged white woman, her face flushed with visible irritation. She came to an abrupt stop beside Daniel's car, her tires screeching slightly as she braked. The woman, later identified as Carol Walker, rolled down her window and leaned out, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Hey, that was my asterisk spot," she yelled, her tone demanding acknowledgement, as if her claim to the space was beyond question. Daniel, startled by her abruptness, glanced over to her with confusion. He tried to explain that he hadn't seen her indicating for the spot, but Carol wasn't having it. She cut him off mid-sentence, her words becoming more hostile with each exchange. "You people always do this, taking things that don't belong to you," she sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. The implication in her words hit Daniel hard. The atmosphere shifted from a minor dispute over parking to something much darker. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, but he took a deep breath, attempting to stay calm. Years of facing situations like this had taught him that reacting in anger could easily backfire. "Look, ma'am, it's just a parking spot. I didn't see you waiting for it," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He opened his car door to exit, hoping the physical action of walking away would end the confrontation. But Carol wasn't done. She swung open her door and got out, now standing between their cars. She was tall, her shoulders squared as if she were ready for a fight, her fingers gripping the edges of her door with tension. "You think you can just ignore me?" Carol spat, her eyes narrowing with fury. Daniel, who had been trying to remain composed, found it increasingly difficult to let her words roll off his back. He could feel the eyes of onlookers gathering, some discreetly watching from their cars, others slowly walking by with their heads turning toward the altercation. He attempted to walk away, but Carol's next words stopped him in his tracks. She hurled a racial slur in his direction, the word hanging heavy in the air between them. A couple of onlookers gasped audibly, and Daniel felt a sharp jolt of anger cut through his restraint. His hands clenched involuntarily and his jaw tightened as he turned back to face her. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice tinged with incredulity and hurt. Carol's lips twisted into a satisfied smirk, as if she had finally struck a chord she had been aiming for. Emboldened by his reaction, she stepped forward and shoved him with one hand, pushing against his chest. "You heard me," she taunted, her voice now carrying an almost mocking tone. Daniel stumbled slightly but regained his balance. He raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace, hoping to de-escalate. But Carol's anger seemed only to grow with his attempt at defusing the situation. Before he could utter another word, Carol raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sound of the slap echoed in the parking lot, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Daniel's cheeks stung, and his mind raced through a flood of conflicting emotions: shock, anger, embarrassment. Years of practice and patience had taught him to endure words, but now the physicality of the situation made it impossible to ignore. He felt the pressure building within him, his instincts fighting against his deeply ingrained caution. Carol stood there, her chest heaving with her own rage, seemingly daring him to react, and react he did. Daniel, now faced with a direct and physical threat, acted out of a sense of self-defense. His hand came up almost reflexively, delivering a slap in return. It wasn't a harsh blow, but it was enough to jolt Carol and shift the dynamics of their encounter. She staggered back a step, her expression shifting from fury to shock. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the parking lot continuing on around them. Carol's eyes widened, and a look of disbelief crossed her face. She muttered something under her breath, a mix of curses and accusations, before storming off toward the store's entrance. Daniel stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He glanced around, seeing the curious stares of strangers who had witnessed the confrontation. He could feel their silent judgments weighing on him, and it made his skin prickle with unease. Taking a deep breath, he turned and walked into the store, trying to push the encounter to the back of his mind. As he moved through the aisles, Daniel found it difficult to focus. The confrontation replayed in his mind in an endless loop, each iteration adding to his frustration. He grabbed the items he needed absent-mindedly, his mind clouded with lingering anger and disbelief. The words she had hurled at him echoed in his thoughts, bringing with them memories of past encounters, past slights, and past injustices he had been forced to endure. After paying for his groceries, he made his way back to the parking lot. The afternoon sun had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the cars. When he reached his vehicle, he stopped dead in his tracks. Along the side of his car were deep scratches, lines that carved through the paint with a vicious intent. His first reaction was disbelief, but that quickly morphed into anger as the realization set in. Carol had done this, and she had done it deliberately. The act wasn't just vandalism, it was a message, a personal attack meant to further humiliate and anger him. Daniel felt his hands begin to tremble with suppressed rage. He ran a hand over the gouges, the rough edges under his fingertips grounding him in reality. He had hoped the situation was over, but now he was faced with a clear reminder of Carol's vendetta. His thoughts raced, his emotions swirling as he considered his next move. Should he call the police? Would they believe him? Or would they side with Carol's narrative if she spun it her way? As he stood there debating, a familiar voice called out. It was Carol, standing a few feet away, leaning against the white SUV. She was watching him with a cruel smile, her arms crossed over her chest. "Oh, did I scratch your little car?" she mocked, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Oops. That was the last straw for Daniel. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling slightly as he dialed 911. As he spoke to the dispatcher, Carol climbed into her SUV, her face smug and defiant. Daniel watched her closely, ready to tell the dispatcher everything. But just as he was finishing the call, Carol put her car into reverse, revving the engine loudly. Before he could react, she slammed her SUV into the side of his car, causing a jarring crash. "Hey!" Daniel shouted, instinctively moving forward. But Carol sped off, tires screeching as she exited the parking lot. His shock quickly gave way to determination. Enough was enough. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. Still on the line with the dispatcher, he relayed Carol's description and her license plate number. He hurried into his car and began to follow her, keeping a safe distance as he updated the police on their location. Carol's SUV weaved through suburban streets, clearly trying to lose him. But Daniel remained steady, his focus sharpening. He knew he needed to stay calm and let the authorities handle it from here. As they approached a red light, he saw flashing blue lights ahead. The police had arrived, setting up a checkpoint in anticipation of Carol's escape attempt. She slowed down, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt a sense of relief wash over him. But he knew this wasn't over yet. The red light at the intersection forced Carol to slow down, but as she approached, her SUV's brake lights flickered uncertainly. Daniel could sense the tension from the distance between their cars. He kept his own vehicle at a cautious distance, watching her every movement. He knew that any sudden action from her could escalate an already volatile situation. Ahead, the police were waiting, their cruisers positioned strategically to create a barrier. A couple of officers stood at the ready, their eyes tracking Carol's approach. When Carol reached the checkpoint, an officer raised a hand signaling for her to stop. Her SUV hesitated before coming to a jerky halt, the brake lights flashing erratically. Daniel pulled over a safe distance away, parking his car near the edge of the intersection. He stayed in his vehicle, observing as the officers cautiously approached Carol's SUV. His hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white from the pressure. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline from the chase still surging through his veins. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Carol's window. She rolled it down just enough to peer out, her face partially obscured by the shadows inside the vehicle. The officer introduced himself, his voice firm but not aggressive. He asked Carol to step out of the vehicle, explaining that they had received reports of an altercation and property damage involving her SUV. Carol's response was immediate and defensive. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "I didn't do anything. This is ridiculous." She threw a quick, sharp glance toward Daniel's car, her eyes narrowing as she tried to gauge his next move. It was clear she was preparing to spin the situation in her favor, and Daniel felt his stomach twist with apprehension. The officer repeated his request, his tone firm and unyielding. Carol reluctantly opened her door and stepped out, but her body language was defiant, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her chin held high. She seemed to be mentally preparing herself for what was to come, already strategizing her next steps. She immediately began talking, her voice laced with indignation. "This is harassment," she exclaimed, pointing in Daniel's direction. "That man has been following me, threatening me. He tried to attack me in the parking lot." Her voice quivered slightly, and for a moment, it seemed like she was trying to muster up tears. Her words were crafted to cast herself as the victim, attempting to preemptively undermine any accusations against her. The officers exchanged a brief glance, their expressions unreadable. One of them nodded, signaling for Daniel to approach. Daniel took another deep breath before opening his car door. His legs felt stiff as he stepped out, the tension in his muscles a reminder of the stress he'd been under. He walked toward the officers, trying to maintain a calm demeanor despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. When he reached the group, the officer in charge turned to him, introducing himself and asking Daniel to explain what had happened. Daniel recounted the events, carefully detailing the confrontation in the parking lot, the vandalism to his car, and Carol's subsequent actions. As he spoke, he could see Carol's expression hardening, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was waiting for her chance to discredit him, ready to jump in at any opportunity. When Daniel finished, Carol didn't waste a second. "That's not true," she interjected, her voice sharp and insistent. "He's lying. He attacked me, and now he's trying to make it look like it's my fault." She turned to the officers, her eyes wide with feigned distress. "You have to believe me. I was just trying to get away from him. He's dangerous." One of the officers raised a hand, signaling for Carol to calm down. "Ma'am, we're going to take a look at the vehicles and review the damage," he said, his tone measured. He gestured toward Daniel's car, indicating that they would inspect the side where the scratches in the impact occurred. Carol's eyes darted between the officers and Daniel, her breathing becoming slightly uneven. She was starting to lose the composure she had carefully constructed, and Daniel could sense the shift in her demeanor. As the officers walked over to examine the cars, Daniel stood back, watching them carefully. He felt a slight sense of relief knowing that the evidence was clear. Carol's SUV had left visible marks on his car, and the scratches were unmistakably deliberate. He hoped that this would be enough to prove his account, but a nagging voice in the back of his mind reminded him that situations like these didn't always end fairly. While the officers were inspecting the damage, Carol's frustration began to boil over. She paced back and forth beside her SUV, her arms flailing slightly as she muttered to herself. Her attempts to maintain a facade of innocence were slipping, and Daniel could see her anger bubbling to the surface. She kept shooting accusatory glares in his direction, as if willing him to break under the pressure. One of the officers approached Carol, asking her to stay calm and wait for them to finish their assessment. Carol's response was immediate and explosive. "I am calm," she shouted, her voice breaking slightly. "This is all just a setup. He's trying to frame me." Her hands were clenched into fists and her face was flushed with anger. Daniel could see the cracks forming in her composure, and he knew it was only a matter of time before she completely lost control. The officers finished their inspection and reconvened near their cruisers. They spoke quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing over at Carol and Daniel. After a few moments, one of the officers approached Carol, explaining that based on the evidence, she would need to accompany them to the station for further questioning. Carol's reaction was instantaneous. She took a step back, her eyes widening with disbelief. "You're arresting me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with outrage. Are you serious? Asterisk, he's Asterisk, the one who attacked Asterisk me. Asterisk, she pointed at Daniel, her finger trembling with barely restrained fury. This is insane. The officer remained calm, explaining that they were not arresting her yet, but they needed her to come with them to answer questions. Carol's expression shifted from indignation to desperation. She shook her head violently, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, you don't understand, she insisted, her voice becoming shrill. He's dangerous. You're making a mistake. But the officers remained firm, and when they attempted to guide Carol toward their cruiser, she resisted. Her anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface, finally erupted. She pulled away from the officer's grasp, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. Get your hands off me, she screamed, her voice echoing through the intersection. The officers tried to calm her, but Carol was beyond reason. Her rage reached a boiling point, and in a moment of blind fury, she turned on Daniel. With a furious cry, she lunged at him, her hands reaching out as if to strike. Daniel instinctively stepped back, raising his arms in a defensive posture. The officers acted quickly, intercepting her before she could make contact. They restrained her, struggling to contain her flailing limbs as she continued to shout incoherently. Carol's screams filled the air, a chaotic mix of anger, desperation, and disbelief. Her carefully crafted narrative had crumbled, leaving behind only raw, unchecked fury. The officers wrestled her into the back of their cruiser, her protest gradually fading as the door closed behind her. The silence that followed felt heavy, the echoes of the confrontation lingering in the air. Daniel stood there, his heart still racing from the adrenaline. He felt a mixture of emotions, relief that the situation had been brought under control, but also a lingering sense of unease. He knew that Carol's actions weren't just about a parking dispute or a moment of anger. They were the manifestation of something deeper, something far more troubling. One of the officers approached Daniel, asking if he was all right. Daniel nodded, his voice feeling thick and heavy in his throat. Yeah, I'm fine, he managed to say, though he wasn't sure if it was entirely true. Physically, he was unharmed, but the psychological toll of the encounter was something that couldn't be so easily brushed off. The officer took his statement once more, making sure all the details were documented. As they spoke, the other officers began clearing the scene, redirecting the few curious onlookers who had gathered. Carol's SUV was being prepared for towing, its white exterior now marked with evidence of her reckless actions. When the officers finished taking his statement, Daniel returned to his car, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, staring at the road ahead, trying to collect his thoughts. It wasn't just the physical damage to his car that troubled him, but the deeper implications of what he had just experienced. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. The confrontation was over, at least for now, but he knew that the ramifications would continue to ripple through his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. He started the engine, the familiar hum grounding him in the present. Glancing in his rearview mirror, he saw the police cruiser carrying Carol slowly pull away from the intersection, its lights no longer flashing. As Daniel pulled back onto the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from the end of the ordeal. He had faced prejudice and entitlement before, but something about this encounter felt different, more visceral, more personal. He didn't to know what lay ahead, but he resolved to face it with the same resilience that had carried him through countless challenges before. The courtroom was cold and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos of the events that led up to this moment. Rows of seats were filled with people, a mixture of curious observers, reporters, and those directly connected to the case. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight and his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wore a dark suit and tie, an effort to present himself with the dignity he felt the situation demanded. He could feel the weight of the stares and murmurs as he waited for the proceedings to begin. Each whispered conversation and turned head a reminder of the scrutiny he was under. Across the room at the defendant's table sat Carol, now identified as Carol Thompson. She looked drastically different from the defiant woman he had encountered in the parking lot. Her usual stern expression was replaced with a look of tightly controlled anxiety. She wore a modest dress, her hair neatly pulled back, a calculated attempt to appear innocent and vulnerable. Daniel couldn't help but notice the stark contrast in her demeanor. But he reminded himself that appearances could be deceiving. He knew better than to underestimate Carol's ability to manipulate perceptions. The judge entered, his robe billowing slightly as he took his seat at the bench. He was an older man with a stern face, his eyes scanning the room with practiced authority. The clerk called the court to order, and the atmosphere shifted, the whispers and shuffling of feet ceasing almost immediately. The trial was about to begin. Michelle Hayes, the prosecuting attorney, stood up with a sense of confidence that immediately commanded the attention of the room. Michelle was known for her tenacity and her sharp mind. She had built a reputation for handling complex cases with skill and precision. Her presence was a source of reassurance for Daniel. He had met her only a few times before the trial, but she had been thorough and compassionate, carefully listening to his account and preparing him for the inevitable challenges that lay ahead. Michelle opened with a clear and concise statement, outlining the series of events that had led to this moment. She described the initial confrontation in the parking lot, Carol's racially charged insults, the slap that instigated the physical altercation, and the subsequent acts of vandalism and vehicular assault. As she spoke, her voice was steady and firm, her words painting a vivid picture of Carol's escalating aggression. Carol's defense attorney, on the other hand, tried to craft a narrative that portrayed Carol as the victim of unfortunate circumstances. He was a middle-aged man with a thin, calculating smile and a practiced air of sympathy. He spoke of Carol's supposed bad day, insinuating that her actions had been out of character and driven by momentary frustration. He emphasized Carol's clean record and her respectable standing in the community, attempting to build an image of a woman who had simply made a mistake in the heat of the moment. As the trial progressed, witness testimonies were called to the stand. One by one, individuals who had been in the parking lot that day gave their accounts. A middle-aged woman who had been shopping with her teenage daughter testified that she had seen Carol approach Daniel aggressively, her voice carrying loud insults. The witness described the moment Carol slapped Daniel, her voice wavering slightly as she recounted the shock of seeing the incident unfold. Michelle used the testimony to highlight Carol's escalation of the situation, contrasting it with Daniel's attempts to walk away. Another witness, a store employee who had been on his break near the entrance, confirmed seeing Carol's SUV recklessly speed away from the parking lot after hitting Daniel's car. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact as he described the damage to the vehicles, corroborating Daniel's account of the vandalism and hit-and-run. Each testimony chipped away at Carol's carefully constructed image of a wronged woman, revealing instead a pattern of deliberate and aggressive behavior. The defense, in response, tried to undermine the credibility of the witnesses, attempting to cast doubt on their recollection of events. They insinuated that the onlookers might have been biased or mistaken, but the consistency in their accounts made it clear that Carol's actions had not been mere misunderstandings. Michelle skillfully countered each attempt to discredit the witnesses, using their testimonies to reinforce a narrative of Carol's escalating rage and targeted aggression. When it was Daniel's turn to testify, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to maintain his composure as he approached the witness stand. The judge swore him in, and as he sat down, he glanced at Michelle, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. Michelle guided him through his testimony, asking clear and direct questions. Daniel recounted the events as truthfully and objectively as he could, carefully describing his attempts to de-escalate the confrontation and his reaction to being slapped. He spoke about the vandalism to his car, his decision to call the police, and the terrifying moment when Carol had lunged at him after the police arrived. As he spoke, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, their gazes a mix of curiosity, empathy, and judgment. The defense attorney's cross-examination was as aggressive as Daniel had expected. The attorney tried to paint him as the instigator, insinuating that he had overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. He implied that Daniel's reaction to the slap had been unnecessary and exaggerated, suggesting that Daniel could have simply walked away. Daniel did his best to remain composed, responding to each question as calmly and clearly as possible. He knew that losing his temper or becoming defensive would only play into the narrative the defense was trying to build. So, what do you say to the claim that you were the one who initiated the physical confrontation? The defense attorney asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. Daniel took a steadying breath before responding. I didn't initiate anything, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. I tried to walk away, but she followed me, and then she shoved and slapped me. I reacted out of self-defense. I never wanted it to escalate like that. The attorney pressed further, but Daniel held his ground, refusing to let the insinuations get under his skin. He could see Carol out of the corner of his eye, her expression shifting between anger and worry as the trial unfolded. He knew that she was watching closely, waiting for any sign of weakness that she could exploit. After Daniel's testimony, Michelle introduced the final pieces of evidence: photographs of the damage to his car, security footage from the grocery store that showed Carol's aggressive driving, and police reports detailing the arrest. The evidence painted a damning picture of Carol's behavior, corroborating the accounts given by the witnesses and by Daniel himself. When the time came for closing statements, Michelle spoke with conviction, reiterating the facts of the case and emphasizing the deliberate nature of Carol's actions. She didn't shy away from addressing the racial undertones of the confrontation, acknowledging the deeper implications without letting it overshadow the focus on Carol's accountability. Her words were clear and unyielding, her final statement a powerful reminder of the need for justice in the face of aggression and prejudice. The defense, in contrast, tried one last time to appeal to the jury's sympathies. Carol's attorney spoke of her character and her contributions to the community, painting her as a woman who had simply made a mistake in a moment of emotional turmoil. He implored the jury to consider the possibility that Carol's actions had been driven by fear and confusion rather than malice. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Daniel sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, his mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs. He couldn't help but replay the events in his head, questioning whether he had done enough to convey the truth. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as the minutes ticked by, each passing moment heightening the sense of anticipation and anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, the jury finally returned. The judge asked the foreman to read the verdict, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He glanced over at Carol, who was sitting stiffly in her chair, her face pale and tense. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty. The word hung in the air, its weight almost tangible. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the courtroom, followed by a few murmurs from the observers. Daniel felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over him, his body finally releasing the tension it had been holding for so long. Carol's composure shattered in an instant. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and her face twisted with anger and humiliation. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair in the process, and shouted at the jury, her voice filled with rage. "This isn't fair," she screamed, her fists clenched at her sides. "You're all against me. This is a setup." The bailiffs moved quickly, restraining Carol as she continued to rant and struggle. Her outburst only served to reinforce the truth of her actions, revealing the deep-seated anger that had driven her behavior. Daniel watched in silence, feeling a mixture of vindication and lingering bitterness. He knew that this moment of accountability wouldn't erase the impact of what had happened, but it was a step toward closure. As the bailiffs escorted Carol out of the courtroom, her shouts gradually faded into the background. The judge adjourned the proceedings, and the spectators began to file out of the room, their conversations a low murmur of speculation and commentary. Daniel remained seated for a moment, allowing himself a brief moment of stillness before he stood up. Michelle approached him, offering a few quiet words of encouragement. "You did great up there, Daniel," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "You spoke your truth, and the jury saw that. This isn't just a victory for you. It's a reminder that people like Carol can't act with impunity." Daniel nodded, appreciating her words, but he couldn't shake the sense of lingering bitterness that clung to him. He knew that this victory, while significant, wasn't the end of the story. There were countless others like Carol out there, individuals who acted with entitlement and prejudice, confident that their actions would go unchallenged. As he left the courtroom, Daniel felt the weight of the experience settling on his shoulders. He had faced a trial not just of legal consequences, but of character and resilience. And while justice had been served in this instance, he was acutely aware that the fight against prejudice and entitlement was far from over. The heavy courthouse doors creaked as they swung open, letting a slant of bright autumn sunlight cut through the dim interior. Daniel stepped outside, feeling the cool breeze brush against his face. It was a clear day, crisp and fresh, yet the air felt heavy with the residue of the courtroom drama that had just unfolded. The throng of people exiting the building created a murmur of indistinct conversations, reporters eagerly jotting down notes while onlookers exchanged thoughts in hushed tones. Somewhere to the side, he caught a glimpse of Carol being led away in handcuffs toward a police van. Her face was flushed, her mouth set in a defiant grimace. She was shouting something, but the words were lost in the distance, blending into the white noise of the crowd. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching her disappear from view, and felt a mixture of emotions well up inside him. A part of him wanted to feel victorious, to relish in the validation of being heard, of having his truth acknowledged. But alongside that small sense of relief was a deeper, more profound exhaustion, one that ran deeper than the events of the past weeks. It was an exhaustion born not just from the confrontation with Carol, but from the weight of a lifetime of encounters like this, of a society that forced him to always be prepared to defend his dignity. A few reporters made their way toward him, notebooks and cameras in hand, their questions poised on the tips of their tongues. Daniel instinctively braced himself, his shoulders tensing in anticipation of the barrage of inquiries. But before they could reach him, Michelle Hayes stepped in front of him, positioning herself between Daniel and the approaching journalists. Her presence was authoritative and protective, a shield against the prying eyes and probing questions. "Mr. Johnson has no further comments at this time," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The reporters hesitated, exchanging glances before reluctantly backing off, retreating to speculate and scribble their observations. Michelle turned to Daniel, offering a brief, sympathetic smile. "You handled yourself well in there," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I know it wasn't easy, but you stood your ground, and that counts for something." Daniel nodded, his lips curving into a faint, appreciative smile. "Thanks, Michelle," he replied, his voice heavy with fatigue. "For everything." She placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of both solidarity and reassurance. "You did the hard part, Daniel," she said. "All I did was make sure the jury heard it." They stood there for a moment in silence, neither needing to say more. Then with a final nod, Michelle turned and made her way back inside the courthouse, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. He wanted to believe that this was the end of it, that he could leave the courthouse and put this whole ordeal behind him. But he knew that wasn't how these things worked. The trial might have concluded, but the implications of what had happened would linger far beyond the verdict. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from his sister, asking if he was okay and offering to meet him for lunch. He considered it for a moment, appreciating the offer of companionship, but ultimately decided that he needed some time to himself. He replied with a brief "thank you" and a promise to call her later. As he walked to his car, parked in the lot just beyond the courthouse steps, he felt an almost surreal disconnect from everything that had just happened. The parking lot was eerily quiet, in contrast to the bustling tension inside the courthouse. He unlocked his car and got in, the familiar hum of the engine grounding him in the present. The drive home was a blur, the streets passing by in a haze as his thoughts wandered between the trial and the long, winding path that had brought him to this moment. When he arrived home, the silence of his small suburban house felt both comforting and overwhelming. He closed the door behind him and stood in the entryway, taking in the quiet. The walls, decorated with family photos and mementos from trips long past, seemed to bear witness to his every triumph and hardship. He dropped his keys on the counter and walked to the living room, sinking into the worn-out couch with a weary sigh. The house felt empty without his usual routine to occupy his mind. On any other day, he would have thrown on some music or flipped on the television to drown out the quiet. But today he found himself sitting in silence, his mind replaying the events of the trial and everything that had led up to it. It wasn't just Carol's actions that weighed on him, but what they represented, a pattern he had faced time and time again, in countless variations. His thoughts drifted back to the parking lot that day. He remembered the moment Carol hurled those hateful words at him, the shock and anger that had gripped him, and the slap that had shattered whatever restraint he had managed to hold on to. He thought about all the moments in his life when he had been made to feel small, diminished by the words and actions of people who saw his skin color as a justification for their disdain. He had always tried to rise above it, to choose patience over anger, but that day something had snapped. He wondered if that was what Carol had wanted, to provoke a reaction, to paint him as the aggressor in her narrative. He knew that people like her existed everywhere, hiding their prejudice behind false smiles and carefully constructed personas until the moment they were challenged. And he knew that no matter how many Carols were held accountable, there would always be more. People who saw themselves as entitled to belittle others, who believed that their privilege gave them the right to treat others as lesser. The thought made him feel both weary and defiant. He had won today, but the victory felt hollow in the face of a society that still harbored the same prejudices and entitlements that had led to this confrontation in the first place. It was a battle he had been fighting for most of his life, and he knew it wouldn't end with a single courtroom verdict. As he sat there, the exhaustion finally caught up to him. He leaned back, closing his eyes and letting out a long, slow breath. He wanted to let go of the anger and bitterness, but it clung to him like a heavy coat, weighing him down. He couldn't help but think about all the others who had faced similar struggles, those whose voices hadn't been heard, whose stories had been dismissed or erased. He thought about the countless instances of everyday prejudice and entitlement that went unchallenged, and the toll it took on those who were forced to endure it. Daniel's phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. This time it was a message from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in a while. The friend had heard about the trial and wanted to offer words of support. Daniel read the message, feeling a small sense of warmth at the gesture. He replied with a brief thank you, appreciating the kindness, but feeling too drained to engage in conversation. After sending the message, Daniel set his phone aside and stared at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness, the sense that the battle wasn't truly over. Even in the aftermath of the trial, he was left grappling with the reality of the world he navigated every day. He knew that the fight against prejudice and entitlement was ongoing, a struggle that would continue long after this chapter of his life had closed. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to find a sense of normalcy, but the trial and its aftermath lingered in his mind. He returned to work, resumed his routines, and reconnected with friends and family. But the experience had left a mark that couldn't easily be erased. Conversations with those close to him inevitably turned to the trial. And while many expressed support and relief at the outcome, Daniel often found himself lost in thought, wondering about the deeper implications of what had happened. One evening, as he sat on his porch, watching the sunset, Daniel's sister stopped by to check on him. She sat down beside him, the two of them watching the sky slowly darken. She didn't press him with questions or words of comfort. She just sat there, offering her quiet presence as a reminder that he wasn't alone. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "You did the right thing, you know," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Standing up for yourself. It's not easy, but you did it." Daniel nodded, appreciating her words, even if he wasn't sure he fully believed them. "It doesn't feel like it sometimes," he admitted, his voice tinged with weariness. "I know," she replied, "but sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good. It just feels necessary." They sat there in silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon. Daniel felt a small measure of peace in that moment, a reminder that even in the face of hardship, he wasn't alone in his struggle. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to keep moving forward, to continue challenging the injustices he encountered, no matter how exhausting the fight might be. As the darkness settled in, Daniel took a deep breath, letting go of some of the bitterness that had weighed him down. He wasn't naive enough to believe that the world would change overnight, or that his actions alone could bring about lasting change. But he knew that every step, every act of defiance against prejudice and entitlement mattered. And in that knowledge, he found the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The night was quiet, and the stars began to emerge one by one, each tiny point of light piercing the darkness. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the cool night air on his face, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. The battle against prejudice and entitlement wasn't over, but for now, he could rest, knowing that he had stood up and spoken his truth. And in a world that often demanded silence, that was a victory in itself.